Jason Harper wiped the sweat from his forehead as he sorted through the dusty attic of his suburban Chicago home. At 38, despite his full-time job as a high school history teacher, he still had the energy to tackle weekend chores like clearing out this long-forgotten space. "What's this?" he muttered, pulling out an old, weathered leather album hidden behind a pile of outdated magazines. Settling down on a creaky trunk, Jason opened the album. A wave of nostalgia hit him as he flipped through the pages, looking at photos of his Irish-American family. His attention stopped on a recent family portrait. "Wow, Emma's grown so much," he thought, gazing at his 14-year-old daughter's features. Something in the back of his mind stirred uneasily. Curious, he found a photo of himself at that same age and started comparing. The differences were subtle, but they stood out. Emma's nose had a slight curve that his didn't, and while her eyes were blue like his, they had an almond shape that didn't seem to fit anywhere in his family tree. He turned the page to a picture of Liam, his 12-year-old son. The boy's skin was a bit darker than his, and his hair was a deeper shade of brown. "It's probably nothing," Jason told himself, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling creeping in. Yet, as he kept staring at the photos, doubt began to take root. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Jason found himself in the dim light of his study, hunched over his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he finally typed, "DNA test kits." "What are you doing, Jason?" His wife, Rebecca, startled him from the doorway, a curious look on her face. Jason quickly closed the laptop. "Oh, just looking up some material for class," he lied, guilt already gnawing at him. "Heading to bed soon?" Rebecca asked, satisfied with his answer. "Yeah, I won't be long," he replied. She nodded and disappeared down the hall. Once she was gone, Jason reopened the laptop and hit confirm purchase for 3 DNA test kits. His heart pounded as he wondered what kind of truth those tests might uncover. Days turned into weeks, each one dragging as Jason anxiously awaited the results. Every morning at breakfast, he found himself staring at Emma and Liam, searching for any trace of resemblance to either him or Rebecca. Finally, the email arrived. With shaky hands, Jason opened the attachment. His own results were exactly as expected, predominantly Irish with other European ancestry. But when he looked at Emma and Liam's results, his stomach dropped. Both showed a large percentage of Mexican heritage. "This can't be right," he whispered, staring in disbelief at the screen. That night, after lying awake for hours, Jason made up his mind, he needed to dig deeper. The next day, he met with a private investigator named Frank at a quiet, out-of-the-way coffee shop. "So, what are we looking for here?" Frank asked, his expression unreadable. Jason leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to find out if my wife's been unfaithful. And if she has, I need to know who with." Frank nodded, taking notes. "Any idea who it could be?" Jason shook his head. "No clue. But my kids, they might not be mine." 2 weeks later, Frank called with news. "Mr. Harper, I think you should come down to my office. There's something you need to see." Jason's heart sank as he stepped into Frank's office and saw the photos spread across the desk. There was Rebecca, his wife of 15 years, wrapped in the arms of another man. A man who, unerringly, bore a striking resemblance to Emma and Liam. "His name's Miguel Ramirez," Frank explained. "He's Rebecca's boss at the construction company. They've been seeing each other for at least 15 years. Jason felt the world spin. 15 years. But we've only been married for 4. Frank nodded grimly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harper, but there's more." He slid over a stack of documents, love letters, emails, hotel receipts. The affair had been ongoing for years, and it was anything but casual. As Jason Harper sifted through the mountain of evidence, his entire world collapsed around him. Every tender moment, every family memory, now felt like it had been stained by this massive deception. Who is he? Jason asked, his voice barely a whisper, his throat tightening. Miguel Ramirez, Frank replied calmly. He's a well-known figure in the local construction business. He's got a good reputation for his charity work and is proud of his Mexican roots. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Jason stared at a photograph of Miguel, noticing the undeniable resemblance to Emma and Liam. My whole life, it's been a lie, Jason muttered, more to himself than to Frank, as the weight of it all came crashing down. Stunned by the truth, Jason knew he couldn't face this alone. He needed his family, hoping they would offer him the support and clarity he desperately sought. That Sunday afternoon, Jason gathered his parents and siblings at his childhood home. The familiar warmth of the house, which usually filled him with comfort, now made him feel nauseous. Even the once inviting smell of his mother's apple pie made his stomach churn. I have something to tell you all, he began, his voice trembling. He laid out the entire heartbreaking story, the DNA tests, the photos, and the grim revelations from the investigation. But as Jason spoke, he noticed an unusual silence settle over the room. His mother avoided his gaze, his father fidgeted in his chair, and his sister, Emily, exchanged a worried glance with their brother, Matt. What's going on? Jason asked, a new wave of panic creeping into his voice. What aren't you telling me? It was Emily who finally broke the silence. Jason, we've known. The words hit him like a freight train. You've known? What do you mean you've known? Jason's father cleared his throat awkwardly. Son, we found out about Rebecca's affair a few years back. We thought it was better not to tell you. Better not to tell me? Jason's voice rose, a mixture of disbelief and rage battling for control. You let me live in a lie. You let me raise kids that might not even be mine. His mother reached out a hand, her voice soft. We thought we were protecting you, Jason. You seemed so happy. Jason recoiled from her touch as if it burned. Happy? I was living in ignorance. How could you keep something like this from me? Matt jumped in defensively. We didn't want to hurt you, man. We figured what you didn't know wouldn't hurt you. Wouldn't hurt me? Jason let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Look at me now. Tell me this doesn't hurt. He stood abruptly, unable to stand the sight of his family any longer. These were the people he had trusted more than anyone in the world, and they had betrayed him just as deeply as Rebecca had. Jason, please, his mother pleaded. We can work through this together. We're here for you. But Jason was already walking toward the door. I don't need your help, he snapped, his voice cold and distant. I don't need any of you. As he stormed out into the fading sunlight, Jason felt more alone than ever before. His wife, his children, even his own flesh and blood, everything he had believed in was built on lies. In that crushing moment of solitude, something inside him shifted. A steely resolve formed. He knew he could no longer trust anyone who had once held his heart. The only person he could rely on now was himself. As he drove home, his mind raced with the magnitude of the betrayals he had uncovered. Jason made a decision. He would take control of this mess. He would make them pay. As the sun set on Jason Harper's old life, so did the last pieces of the trusting, naive man he used to be. In his place stood someone tougher, someone forged by betrayal, determined to take back control of his fate. Jason Harper sat alone in his classroom, staring blankly at the rows of empty desks in front of him. The weight of everything he had recently uncovered seemed to bear down on Jason Harper's shoulders like a heavy, suffocating load. Sleep had become a distant memory, as his mind churned endlessly over the betrayals he had unearthed. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Standing in the doorway was Principal Andrews, his expression serious. Got a minute, Jason? He asked, though it didn't sound like a question. Jason nodded, motioning toward an empty student desk. Andrews settled into the chair, its plastic frame creaking under his weight. "There's no easy way to say this," Andrews began. "But the school board's pushing a new history curriculum. And, well, it's not good." Jason's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, not good?" Andrews let out a heavy sigh and pulled a folder from his briefcase. "Take a look for yourself." As Jason flipped through the papers, his frown deepened with each page. The proposed changes weren't just troubling, they were an outright whitewash of historical events. "This is garbage," Jason muttered, before glancing up, remembering who he was talking to. "Sorry, I just mean," Andrews was already nodding in agreement. "No need to apologize. You're right. It is garbage. But the board is under pressure from some big donors, and they're going to push this through, whether we like it or not." A familiar anger stirred in Jason's chest, the same deep frustration that had been festering since the day he learned the truth about his family. But this? This was something he could fight. "We can't let them do this," he said, his voice filled with determination. Andrews raised an eyebrow. "We?" "Jason, I get where you're coming from, but my hands are tied." "The board." "Screw the board." Jason cut him off, his tone sharp. "These kids deserve better. They deserve the truth." For a moment, it looked like Andrews might push back, but then his shoulders sagged in defeat. "You're right. But what can we do?" Jason stood up and began pacing the room, his thoughts suddenly clearer than they had been in weeks. "We organize. We get the teachers, the parents, and the students involved. We make our voices heard." As he spoke, a plan began to take shape in his mind. This wasn't just about fighting the curriculum changes, it was a way to channel all the anger and frustration that had been eating him alive. Finally, something he could direct his energy toward that mattered. In the following weeks, Jason threw himself into the effort. He organized meetings, wrote up petitions, and rallied support from every corner of the school community. It became his mission, something that gave him purpose in the chaos of his personal life. One evening, as he was finishing up a presentation for the upcoming board meeting, Emma poked her head into his home office. "Dad?" she asked hesitantly. "Can I talk to you?" Jason looked up, a pang of guilt hitting him. He had been so wrapped up in his fight against the curriculum changes that he had barely spoken to his kids. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Emma walked over and perched on the edge of his desk, nervously swinging her feet. "Is everything okay? You've been different lately." Jason's heart clenched. He wanted so badly to tell her the truth, about her real father, the lies, the pain. But seeing the concern in her eyes, he couldn't bring himself to break her heart. "Not yet. I'm sorry, Em," he said softly. "There's just a lot going on with work. But I promise, everything's going to be okay." Emma nodded slowly, though she didn't look completely convinced. "Is that why Mom's been crying at night?" The question hit Jason like a blow to the gut. In all his focus on his own pain and the battle at school, he hadn't even noticed Rebecca's distress. I didn't realize she was crying," he admitted, feeling a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. Emma shrugged lightly. "She tries to hide it, but I hear her sometimes." Jason pulled his daughter into a hug, his mind spinning. He had been so absorbed in fighting this external battle that he had neglected the most important people in his life. Maybe, just maybe, all of this had been a way to avoid facing the truth about his family. "I'll talk to her," he promised Emma. "And I'm really sorry I've been so distracted. How about we have a family game night tomorrow? Just the four of us." Emma's face brightened immediately. "Really? Can we play Monopoly?" Jason chuckled, the sound strange to his own ears. "Sure thing, kiddo. Monopoly it is." As Emma skipped out of the room, Jason turned back to his computer, the weight of everything settling once more on his shoulders. Fighting the curriculum changes was crucial, but so was his family, even if that family wasn't exactly what he had thought it was all these years. Jason Harper knew he had to find a balance between the two. And more importantly, he had to make a decision about what to do with the heavy truth he now carried. As the weeks passed, Jason found himself living a strange double life. By day, he was the passionate teacher, rallying support against the school board's misguided changes. By night, his mind was consumed with thoughts of revenge. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Jason sat alone in his study, surrounded by financial records and legal documents. Frank, the private investigator, had dug up more than just proof of Rebecca's affair. He had uncovered shady dealings at Miguel's construction company, potential tax fraud that could bring the whole business down. Jason's fingers hovered over the keyboard. With just a few clicks, he could send an anonymous tip to the IRS. It would be the first domino to fall, leading to the destruction of Miguel's entire life. But was that really what he wanted? A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Rebecca stood in the doorway, her expression filled with worry. "Jason? Can we talk?" He nodded, quickly minimizing the windows on his computer screen. Rebecca sat on the edge of his desk, her eyes swollen and red from crying. "I'm worried about you," she said quietly. "You've been so distant lately. Is it because of me?" Jason felt a bitter laugh rise up in his throat. If only she knew. "No," he lied, the word tasting sour. "It's just this thing with the school board. It's been taking up all my time." Rebecca nodded, but the look in her eyes told him she wasn't convinced. "I miss you," she whispered, reaching out to touch his hand. For a fleeting moment, Jason almost gave in. He almost told her everything, the affair, the lies, the truth that had shattered his world. But then he remembered the photos Frank had shown him. The love letters. 15 years of betrayal. He pulled his hand away. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. I need some time." Rebecca's face fell, but she nodded and quietly left the room. As soon as the door closed behind her, Jason turned back to his computer. The next day, he met with a divorce attorney, a man with a reputation for being ruthless and winning big. "So, Mr. Harper," the lawyer said, reclining in his leather chair, "what are we dealing with here?" Jason laid out the whole mess, the affair, the doubt surrounding his children's paternity, the betrayal by his own family. The attorney's eyes lit up with anticipation. "This is juicy," he said, rubbing his hands together. "We're going to take her for everything she's got." But Jason shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "I don't want to hurt the kids. I just want what's fair. I want justice." The attorney raised an eyebrow but nodded. Jason could tell he was disappointed. "All right, we'll do it your way. But trust me, in cases like this, it's best to hit hard and fast." Leaving the attorney's office, Jason felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. The wheels were turning now. There was no stopping what he had set in motion. Over the next few weeks, Jason carefully and methodically put his plan into action. He began quietly liquidating their joint assets, moving money into accounts only he had access to. He collected every scrap of evidence Frank had uncovered, preparing an airtight case against Rebecca and Miguel. And then, late one night, when he was certain Rebecca was sound asleep, he made the call to the IRS. His voice trembled slightly as he reported the tax fraud at Miguel's company, but he steeled himself and saw it through. As he hung up the phone, Jason felt a swirl of emotions, relief, anger, and an unfamiliar sense of satisfaction. Part of Jason Harper felt a rush of exhilaration, finally taking control after weeks of simmering anger and helplessness. But another part of him felt empty, questioning whether this path of revenge would truly give him the closure he longed for. He shoved those doubts aside, he had come too far to turn back now. The night of Miguel's company gala arrived, and Jason stood in front of the mirror, his hands trembling as he adjusted his tie. Rebecca appeared behind him, radiant in a sparkling evening gown. "You look handsome," she said, catching his gaze in the reflection. Jason forced a smile. "Thanks. You look stunning." For a brief moment, he almost hesitated. The woman staring back at him in the mirror was the same one he had fallen for all those years ago. But then the memory of her lies, her betrayal, surged back, and his resolve hardened again. The gala took place in an extravagant ballroom, the crystal chandeliers casting a soft, golden glow over the crowd of Chicago's construction elite. Jason watched as Rebecca mingled effortlessly, laughing and chatting as if everything were perfect. She was in her element here, playing the role of the polished, supportive wife. And then, across the room, Jason spotted him, Miguel Ramirez, dressed impeccably in a tailored tuxedo, holding court by the bar. Jason's fists clenched instinctively at his sides. This was the man who had fathered his children, the man who had been sleeping with his wife for 15 years. As the evening dragged on, Jason waited. He made small talk, sipped his whiskey, and kept a close eye on Miguel, biding his time for the right moment. Finally, Miguel stepped up to the podium, his voice booming with confidence and charm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I'm thrilled to share that this has been our most successful year to date. The future of Ramirez Construction has never been brighter." Applause filled the room, and Jason knew this was his moment. He stood, walking toward the podium with a calm, deliberate pace. He could feel Rebecca's eyes on him, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "Excuse me," Jason said, his voice slicing through the applause. "I have something I'd like to add." Miguel's smile flickered, momentarily thrown off balance, but he quickly recovered. "Of course, Jason. Ladies and gentlemen, Jason Harper, husband of our lovely HR director, Rebecca." Jason took the microphone, his heart thundering in his chest. This was it, the moment of reckoning. "Thank you, Miguel," Jason began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I just want to congratulate you on all your success. It really is remarkable what you've built here." He paused, scanning the room. Rebecca stood frozen, her face drained of color. "But I think it's time for some honesty," Jason continued, his voice growing louder. "It's time we all learned the true foundation of this company's success." Jason reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. "In my hand, I have the results of DNA tests proving that Miguel Ramirez is the biological father of my children." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. "I also have evidence of a 15-year affair between Mr. Ramirez and my wife, Rebecca." The room erupted. People were whispering, some even shouting. Miguel's face had turned ghostly pale, his hands gripping the podium so tightly that his knuckles were white. "But that's not all," Jason pressed on, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I also have documents that detail years of tax fraud and embezzlement at Ramirez Construction. And those documents are now in the hands of the IRS and the FBI." The room exploded into pandemonium. Board members leapt to their feet, shouting questions. Investors scrambled toward the exits, panic on their faces. And at the center of the storm stood Miguel and Rebecca, their carefully constructed lives falling apart before their eyes. Jason Harper stood back and watched as the company's owner, his face flushed with rage, stormed over to Miguel. "You're fired," he roared. "And you'd better believe you'll be cooperating fully with any investigation." Rebecca stumbled toward Jason, tears streaming down her face. "Jason," she cried, "how could you do this?" Jason looked at her, feeling a strange combination of satisfaction and sadness. "How could I?" he repeated quietly. "How could you, Rebecca? 15 years of lies. Our entire marriage, it was all built on deception." As security began ushering people out of the ballroom, Jason turned and walked away. Behind him, he could still hear Rebecca's sobs and Miguel's frantic attempts to calm the furious board members, but he didn't look back. Stepping outside, the cool night air hit him like a slap. He loosened his tie and took a few deep breaths. It was over. His revenge was complete. But as Jason stood there, gazing through the ballroom's windows at the chaos he had just unleashed, there was no joy, no triumph. Instead, there was only a hollow emptiness where his anger had burned so intensely before. Hailing a cab, he gave the driver his home address. As the city lights blurred outside the window, Jason wondered what came next. He had torn down the web of lies that had been his life, but now he had to figure out how to rebuild something real from the wreckage. The morning after the gala, Jason woke up to a world that felt irrevocably changed. The taste of victory was bitter, mixed with the lingering sourness of spent rage and betrayal. He lay in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, wondering if this emptiness would ever go away. His phone buzzed non-stop. News of last night's explosive confrontation had spread like wildfire through Chicago's business and social circles. Ignoring the flood of messages, Jason focused instead on his next move in his carefully orchestrated plan. At exactly 9 a.m., Jason walked into the offices of Hartley & Associates, home to one of Chicago's most cutthroat divorce attorneys. Bernard Hartley's reputation preceded him, a shark among minnows, notorious for leaving his clients' ex-spouses with little more than the clothes on their backs. His office was a testament to his success, decked out in polished mahogany and leather, with a breathtaking view of Lake Michigan that probably cost more than most people's entire homes. Hartley himself was a study in contrasts, dressed in an expensive suit but sporting a cheap haircut, his eyes sharp and predatory. "Mr. Harper," Hartley greeted him, standing to shake his hand. "I heard about last night's performance. Quite the spectacle, I must say." Jason nodded and took a seat. "I want this handled quickly and cleanly," he said, placing a thick folder on the desk. "Everything you need is in here." Hartley's eyes gleamed as he flipped through the documents. "Oh, this is good. Very good. With this, we can." "No," Jason interrupted, his voice firm. "I don't want to destroy her completely. I just want what's fair. And I want custody of the kids." Hartley's excitement dimmed slightly, but he nodded. "Of course, Mr. Harper. We'll proceed according to your wishes." Over the next few weeks, Jason's life became a whirlwind of legal meetings and court appearances. Rebecca, cornered by the overwhelming evidence against her, barely put up a fight. The once pristine woman Jason had known now looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and a haunted, defeated expression that never left her face. When the final ruling came down, it was swift and decisive. Jason was awarded full custody of Emma and Liam, along with the majority of their shared assets. Rebecca was left with a modest alimony payment and visitation rights that felt more like an afterthought than a victory. As Jason left the courthouse, he spotted Rebecca sitting alone on a bench, her head buried in her hands. She looked so small, so utterly broken. For a moment, Jason felt a pang of something, pity, maybe, but he quickly pushed it aside. This was the price she had paid for her lies, and there was no going back. For a brief moment, Jason Harper felt a flicker of something. Was it pity? Regret? But then he reminded himself of the years of lies, the betrayal that had gutted his life from the inside out, and he kept walking without a glance back. Meanwhile, across the city, Miguel Ramirez was living out his own personal nightmare. The IRS investigation, sparked by Jason's anonymous tip, had uncovered years of tax fraud and embezzlement. The pristine reputation Miguel had built in the construction industry was now in ruins. Desperate to cling to his luxurious lifestyle, he turned to gambling as a last resort. At first, it was just small bets at legitimate casinos. But as his losses piled up and desperation took over, Miguel descended into the dark world of Chicago's illegal gambling rings. One night, in the smoky back room of a dingy bar, Miguel found himself at a poker table, his brow slick with sweat. He was down to his last chip, having already lost everything, his savings, his home, and any shot at redeeming his name in the industry. "All in," he croaked, shoving his final chip forward. The dealer, a man with cold, dead eyes and fingers yellowed by nicotine, dealt the last card. Miguel's hands trembled as he flipped his cards over. "House wins," the dealer droned, his voice flat and emotionless. Miguel staggered away from the table, his world spinning. He had lost everything. In just a few short months, he had fallen from being one of Chicago's most admired businessmen to a destitute gambler, drowning in debt. As he stumbled out into the biting cold of the Chicago night, Miguel Ramirez finally realized that the life he had built on lies and deceit had completely collapsed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Jason Harper slept soundly for the first time in months, his revenge fully realized. The "For Sale" sign stood stark against the well-kept lawn of the Harper family home. Jason stood in the driveway, watching as the realtor hammered it into the ground. Each strike of the mallet felt like another nail sealing the coffin of his old life. "Dad?" Emma's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Are we really leaving?" Jason turned to his daughter, seeing the blend of uncertainty and hope in her eyes. At 14, Emma was old enough to grasp the broad strokes of what had happened, even if she didn't know all the sordid details. "Yeah, sweetheart, we are," he said, pulling her into a hug. "It's time for a fresh start." Liam came bounding out of the house, his 12-year-old energy unfazed by the upheaval of the last few months. "I call shotgun on the moving truck," he yelled, racing toward the driveway. Despite everything, the lies, the betrayal, the public spectacle of the divorce, Jason couldn't help but smile. His kids had shown a resilience that amazed him. They had chosen to stay with him, recognizing the unwavering love and support he had offered them, even in the face of the shocking truth about their biological father. The move wasn't just about changing their address. It was about leaving behind the weight of deception and starting fresh. Jason had accepted a position as the new principal at Oak Ridge Academy, a respected private school known for its progressive approach to teaching history. It felt like the perfect opportunity to rebuild, for him and the kids. As they pulled out of the driveway for the final time, Jason caught sight of their neighbors peeking out from behind their curtains. He knew they were probably relieved to see the Harpers go, tired of the whispers and scandals that had hung over their quiet suburban street. The drive to their new home was filled with a mix of the kids' excited chatter and long stretches of thoughtful silence. Jason's mind drifted back to the curriculum debate that had consumed him in the midst of his personal turmoil. There was still so much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of optimism about what lay ahead. Jason Harper's victory in the curriculum fight had gained him a new level of respect in educational circles, opening doors he never imagined. As they crossed the state line, leaving the familiar skyline of Chicago behind, Jason felt a sense of relief. The anger that had driven him for so long began to fade, replaced by a cautious hope for what lay ahead. Their new house was smaller than the one they left behind, but it felt brighter somehow. Large windows allowed sunlight to pour in, illuminating the empty rooms that seemed full of possibility and new beginnings. As Emma and Liam raced through the house, picking out bedrooms and arguing over closet space, Jason stood quietly in the living room, taking it all in. The first few weeks in their new town were a whirlwind of unpacking, getting ready for school, and meeting new faces in the community. Jason dove headfirst into his new position at Oak Ridge Academy, determined to make a positive difference in his students' lives. But amidst the busy days, Jason realized something deeper. It wasn't enough just to move on, he needed to heal. The betrayal he had endured left scars, ones that wouldn't fade without effort. On a whim, he decided to start a support group for people who had been betrayed by their spouses. The first meeting was held in a small room at the local community center, with just 3 other people in attendance. "My name is Jason," he began, his voice slightly shaky, "and I'm here because my wife of 15 years had an affair with her boss. An affair that resulted in 2 children I believed were mine." As the words left his mouth, Jason felt a heavy weight lift off his chest. Just speaking his truth to others who understood brought a release he hadn't expected. Week by week, the group grew. People from all walks of life, connected by the common thread of betrayal, found comfort and strength in each other's stories. Jason discovered a newfound sense of purpose in helping others navigate the pain of broken trust and shattered relationships. It was at one of these meetings that Jason met Alexandra. She sat quietly at the back of the room, her dark hair framing a face that held both strength and vulnerability. When she finally spoke, her story of betrayal and resilience resonated deeply with Jason. After the meeting, they lingered, talking easily. Alexandra, it turned out, was also an educator, a history teacher at a high school nearby. "I've heard wonderful things about what you're doing at Oak Ridge," she said, a spark of admiration in her eyes. "Your approach to teaching history is really inspiring." A warmth spread through Jason's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. "Thank you," he replied, meaning it. "It's been challenging, but in a good way." As the weeks passed and turned into months, Jason and Alexandra's friendship grew deeper. They pushed each other intellectually, sharing ideas about teaching, life, and everything in between. She encouraged him to think outside the box, to explore more progressive methods in the classroom. One evening, as they walked through a quiet park after an intense conversation about the role of education in social justice, Jason realized that something inside him had shifted. The hollow emptiness he had carried for so long was now filled with something new, something hopeful. He turned to Alexandra, and he could see that she felt it too. Slowly, they leaned in, their first kiss gentle and hesitant, a quiet promise of something genuine and honest. As they pulled apart, Jason felt a mix of emotions, excitement, yes, but also fear. I'm not sure I'm ready for this," he admitted softly. Alexandra squeezed his hand, offering a reassuring smile. "That's okay," she said. "We've got time." For the first time in years, Jason Harper felt a real sense of hope as he looked toward the future. 5 years passed in a blur of school events, family dinners, and quiet evenings spent with Alexandra. Life, once filled with betrayal and heartbreak, had slowly rebuilt itself, layer by layer, into something new and meaningful. Jason Harper's life had settled into a routine he never thought possible after his divorce. Emma, now 19, was flourishing in her first year of college, and Liam, at 17, had become captain of his high school debate team. His sharp wit and passion for justice filled Jason with immense pride. It was a crisp autumn morning when the call came. Jason was in his office at Oak Ridge Academy, reviewing applications for a new history teacher, when his phone buzzed. The number wasn't familiar, but something urged him to pick it up. "Hello. Jason? It's Rebecca. Christina's sister." Jason's stomach dropped. He hadn't heard from anyone in Christina's family since the divorce. "Rebecca? What's going on?" There was a pause, the kind that carries unsaid words. Then Rebecca's voice came through, soft but heavy. "It's Christina. She's gone, Jason. She passed away last night." The world tilted for a moment. Jason gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. "What happened?" "It was her heart," Rebecca said, her voice breaking. "An undiagnosed condition. She died in her sleep." As Rebecca continued to talk, filling in the details of funeral arrangements and the legal formalities, Jason felt strangely disconnected. He didn't feel joy in Christina's passing, but he also didn't feel the overwhelming sorrow he might have expected. It was as though he were hearing about the death of a distant acquaintance, not the woman he had once promised to love forever. But then Rebecca said something that caught him off guard. "Jason, there's something else you should know," she began, her tone laced with guilt and sadness. "Christina, she's had a hard time these past few years. After the divorce, after everything with Miguel, she couldn't find a job in her field. The scandal, you know." Jason listened in stunned silence as Rebecca described Christina's final years. Unable to secure a position in human resources or in any corporate role, she'd been working as a janitor at a local community college, scraping by in a small, run-down apartment, barely able to make ends meet. And Miguel? Jason found himself asking, though he wasn't sure why it mattered anymore. Rebecca let out a bitter laugh. That scumbag fled to Mexico about a year ago. Gambling debts, from what I hear. Left Christina to handle things on her own. When the call ended, Jason sat alone in his office, the silence around him feeling heavier than usual. The life he had built over the last 5 years suddenly felt fragile, as if the shadows of his past could reach out and crack it at any moment. That evening, he gathered Emma and Liam in the living room. Alexandra sat nearby, offering her quiet, unwavering support. "Kids," Jason began, his voice calm but weighed down by the day's revelations, "I have some news about your mother." He watched their faces closely as he shared the details, ready to offer comfort or explanations if needed. But Emma and Liam, now on the brink of adulthood, received the news with a maturity that surprised, and saddened, him. "Do you think we should go to the funeral?" Emma asked, her voice soft. Jason looked at his daughter, seeing pieces of Christina reflected in her. "I think it's something we should decide together," he said gently. "It's okay if you want to go. It's also okay if you don't." After a long discussion, filled with tears and quiet moments of reflection, they made the decision as a family to attend the funeral. Not out of duty, Jason Harper realized, but as a way to find closure. It was the final chapter in a story that had shaped their lives in ways both painful and profound. The day of the funeral arrived, cool and overcast. Jason stood between Emma and Liam at the graveside, holding their hands tightly in his. As the priest recited the final prayers, Jason's mind drifted, replaying the long and twisted path that had brought him here. His revenge had brought a form of justice, that much was true. But standing here, watching his children say goodbye to a mother they barely knew, Jason realized something important: revenge hadn't brought him happiness. That had come later, through his own resilience, his dedication to his children, and his commitment to his principles. As they turned to leave the cemetery, Jason squeezed his children's hands. He looked at them closely, really looked at them, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the life they had now, a life free from lies, built on the foundation of honesty and unconditional love. They walked together toward the parking lot, where Alexandra stood by the car, waiting. Her presence was a comforting reminder of the new chapter they were building together, one founded on trust, integrity, and the unbreakable bonds of a chosen family. As they drove away from the cemetery, leaving behind the last tangible tie to their old life, Jason felt a wave of peace wash over him. The future ahead was uncertain, yes, but he no longer feared it. He had his children, he had Alexandra, and most importantly, he had a life grounded in truth. The ghosts of his past would always linger, shadows in the corners of his memory, but they no longer held power over him. Jason Harper had faced his demons, walked through the storm of betrayal, and emerged stronger on the other side. As the car merged onto the highway, heading toward home, Jason glanced in the rearview mirror at Emma and Liam. They were talking quietly, heads bent together in a shared moment. In that instant, Jason knew with absolute certainty that despite all the heartache and pain, he wouldn't change a thing. It was those very trials that had forged the bond they now shared, one not bound by blood or false promises, but by choice, love, and an unwavering commitment to honesty. The future stretched out before them like a blank canvas, ready to be filled with new memories, new joys, and new love. And for the first time in a long while, Jason Harper was truly, deeply happy.